Chris? Okay. Well, it's the bottom of the hour. Welcome, everybody. My name is Meghan Lane-Fall. I'm the Executive Director of the Penn Implementation Science Center. It's my pleasure and honor to welcome you to our Implementation Science Grant Tips and Tricks session. We're going to talk to you for about, or we're going to have a moderated discussion for about an hour and then lots of time for questions. So we scheduled 90 minutes. We certainly don't have to go that long. This session will be recorded. So for those of you that are interested, you can access the recording. We should have it posted by the end of the week. There is one slide for this session and you're looking at it. So we originally scheduled this with Dr. Kate Rendle and Dr. Florence Momsplaisir. We've had the pleasure of being joined by Dr. Amanda Bettencourt and Dr. Chris Bonafide. Dr. Momsplaisir is going to have to leave us for another talk at about the top of the hour. So we'll have her for now. That's why I wanted to get started right away. But these are the folks that are talking to you. So I'm going to ask each person to say hello, kind of what your discipline is, and tell us a little bit about your grant journey in a minute or so. And we'll kind of go through everybody and then we'll go into some moderated questions. And if you have questions, please put them in the chat. I think we'll have plenty of time to get to them. So I'll start with Florence.
Thanks so much, Megan. So I am Florence Momsplaisir. I'm an assistant professor in the Division of Infectious Diseases. I am an adult ID physician by training and also a physician scientist. I serve as director of the Penn Center for AIDS Research Implementation Science Core, and I get to work with Megan and Kate in that capacity. And my research really focuses at the intersection of HIV, HIV prevention, and implementation science. I spend a lot of time thinking about the development and also the implementation of evidence-based intervention in order to improve the HIV care continuum. Maybe I'll stop here and then I can share maybe after we do the introductions, how I really got to be interested in implementation science and how my research sort of evolved there.
That sounds great. And for those of you that are joining, I'll signpost, Florence did not start in implementation science. So I know there are some of you on the call that are established investigators and you're sort of like, what is this thing? So hopefully some of her experience will resonate with you. Let's go to Kate.
Hey, my name is Kate Rendle. I am a interdisciplinary behavioral and implementation scientist. What does that mean? I'm trained in several different disciplines. I am not a clinician. I work very closely with clinicians in all of my work. I'm trained as an anthropologist, macro social work, policy evaluation, and then also epidemiology. So I sort of bring those together to do the work that I do. The vast majority of my work is in the cancer care continuum, everything from primary prevention through survivorship. I currently work a lot in cervical and lung, both screening and care. And I work both in the domestic setting and also in Botswana, particularly with cervical cancer, which of course crosses over to people living with HIV, which have much higher rates of cervical cancer in that population. So that's me.
Awesome, thank you. Amanda, can we go to you?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Amanda Bettencourt. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Family and Community Health here at Penn and the director of acute care implementation research at PISCE. My clinical background is as a pediatric acute and critical care clinical nurse specialist, for the most part, working with burn and trauma patients in the hospital setting. I found implementation science as a doctoral student here at Penn, mostly with a health services research background. Ended up doing a postdoc at the University of Michigan focused on implementation science. And now my program of research really is focused on how teams change practice in the acute care setting, and specifically how we test different strategies with different groups of folks to motivate them to want to change. So that's broadly speaking, and I can say some more about my individual things later, but excited to chat with everyone today, and thanks for having me, Megan.
Oh, thanks so much. How about Chris?
Hey everyone, Chris Bonafide. I'm a physician. I work clinically as a pediatric hospitalist over at CHOP and work as director of pediatric implementation research here at PISCE. My journey was I did an academic general pediatric fellowship, and in that process got a K award, but was very focused on effectiveness related research at that time. And then through taking the semester long implementation science course that Renat and Megan were running at that time, really opened my eyes to implementation science as a really exciting way to think about how to change practice in the pediatric hospital setting, to either align and get better uptake of evidence-based practices, or one of the other things that I'm really interested in is de-implementation. So thinking about how to get people to stop doing things in the pediatric hospital setting that are not evidence-based, and have developed a portfolio since then that I'm happy to talk about later on.
Thanks, Chris. And I'll round it out. I'm another physician. I'm an anesthesiologist and critical care physician by training. Most of my work now is in implementation science. I do my own research that is at the intersection of safety and human factors engineering and implementation science, but most of the portfolio is doing collaborative work around maternal health, a little bit on some structural racism work that's being led by Gina South and Aveen Venkataramani, and a lot of capacity building work. So I will say that we all have been successful in getting grants, and we have all failed at getting grants. We will talk about failure too. But I'm going to stop sharing here so everybody can see us, and then we'll move on to a moderated discussion. So Day, can I ask you to pin all the panelists so they're visible to everybody? And then I'll start off by Florence, can I go to you? Tell
Absolutely.
us what brought you into this and into implementation science, because you sort of started in another space, and kind of what whet your appetite to kind of get deeper into this.
Yeah. And Denise, do you mind muting, please? Thank you. But so I'd like to start by saying that so my journey has not been linear at all. As I mentioned before, I am a physician, and I really started doing research really after getting my master's in health policy research after residency. And my research has mainly been informed by my patients, honestly, through what I see is going on the ground, the questions that they ask me, the things that sort of evolved. And that's how my interest in HIV and women's health really started. And from that, I obtained pilot data that informed a R1 application that was successful. And in that application, we proposed to test a peer-led behavioral intervention to improve postpartum retention and care. So a lot of my work very early on really focused on intervention development, behavioral health, and HIV. It's really after gaining the skills on the ground, working with communities, that the transition to implementation science made a lot of sense for me. What really opened my eyes to the world of implementation science has been through the initiative of ending the HIV epidemic, where the NIH has put a lot of focus on investing on the implementation and the scale up of evidence-based practice. Because in HIV care, we do have a lot of tools that are vastly unutilized. And that has been really sort of the focus. And in that work, we decided to use community health workers to implement an evidence-based practice called managed problem solving. And that work has been challenging. It's been rewarding. And it's been great to be in the space where we can actually do work on the ground and sort of, hope for real world impact. And so yes, I've sort of transitioned to the space. And so for those of you who are at that season in your life where you're thinking about implementation science and want to learn more about it, I think I'm sort of closer to that stage compared to others on the panel here.
That's great. Thank you. So if we think about implementation science as the study of planned human behavior change under organizational constraints, that's what Ann Sales calls it. That's my new favorite definition. It does require a little bit of a frame shift as you think about approaching a funder. So maybe I'll ask Chris and Florence. So Florence, I'm going to lean on you a little bit because I know you've got to leave us at the top of the hour. Can you reflect on what's different about writing an implementation science grant proposal as compared to something that's not focused on IS?
Sure, I can start, and then Florence, maybe you can jump in. So let's see. When I've approached this, first, I think it makes sense to think about where you are on sort of the effectiveness to implementation path for a particular intervention. So I'll give an example. The first implementation science grant that I wrote was related to de-implementation of a practice that we use a lot in pediatrics called continuous pulse oximetry monitoring. And it turns out that we have evidence and 3 sets of guidelines existing that tell us that we should not use continuous pulse oximetry monitoring in a particular group of hospitalized patients at a particular time. So for me, we were at a point where there was not a lot of need to generate a lot more clinical evidence about whether or not this practice was ineffective. We had all of that data established, but we needed to figure out how to change practice because we knew we were still overusing that practice. So when we were thinking about how to take this to the funder, really the premise was exactly what I just described. Like, we know we shouldn't be doing this. We don't need to spend more money trying to figure out if this is effective or ineffective. What we need to do is figure out how to change practice to align with these existing guidelines. So that was, I think, the major frame shift, and that allowed us to then focus on how we might, in a rigorous way, identify de-implementation strategies that we might apply, and then set up a compelling experiment to try and figure out the best way to choose the right de-implementation strategies that we might recommend and subsequent to the trial.
Yeah, and if I can also add to what Chris mentioned, I think for me, the big shift was the unit of change, right? So previously in my work, I focus on patient level interventions, meaning that, you know, all of the goal was to empower patients to be able to stay in care and take their antiretroviral therapy. The shift with implementation science is that the unit is really sort of the system, right? Like the clinic, and thinking of processes and ways to implement interventions that we know are already efficacious, and sort of think about the actual process of implementation. And in that shift, the patient is important, but is not as central, right? When thinking of the measures and also the outcomes that we're trying to achieve. In the trial that I mentioned, with the community health workers, is a hybrid type 2. So we are measuring both clinical and implementation science outcomes. But to me, it was a real shift, right? To really think about systems and not so much patients. And also because I'm a clinician by nature, it took some time to sort of have that shift for me.
That's great. Thank you. Amanda, as I reflect on your experience, I know that when you left Penn, you went to do a K-12 at the University of Michigan. And so in the training role, it's really exciting to do implementation science, and you have no money. So can you talk a little bit about the approach? If you're applying for pilot grants, and I think all of us have been in this situation, if you're applying for pilot grants that are like $5,000, $10,000, $20,000, how are you writing a compelling pilot grant as an early stage person? I'd love to hear what you have to say about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's always that transition when have K funding, so you have all this time to devote to your thing, but it's not your own program. You've got to find the right people to partner with. And those people have to be generous to give you slices of their already funded thing that you can get a little bit of foundation money to work on, that kind of leads you towards your ultimate first big independent research grant. For me, I don't know if I used to describe this as getting lucky, but I do think it was actually planned even though I hadn't thought about it this way. But I had done a bunch of totally unfunded research into burn mass casualty planning, because I had been a burn clinician involved nationally for a long time before I started pursuing implementation science. And I think it's similar to what others are saying, right? You've got research already in your specialty, and now you're like, well, how do I do implementation research? So I think I was able to leverage those projects that were high profile but not funded to show that I had expertise in the field, and then to also slant those towards, and by the way, what we actually need is to get people to do this thing, not necessarily keep on studying what the thing is people should do. So I think I got lucky in sort of my burn world to kind of be involved in some free projects and get small amounts of money to do like other analyses on data that helped me position myself when it was time to write for that first big independent grant as somebody who had data, had a rationale for why, and then looked mostly credible. And then I honestly would say, like, people like Chris and other folks were really generous in slicing off chunks of their study that was already funded and giving me the opportunity to kind of make my voice in implementation science. And I think that was super helpful, and it didn't really cost me or them much. So I think it's kind of like figuring out the why for what's missing in your portfolio so that you look like somebody who can handle implementation research independently, leaning on mentors for sure. And then if the clinical stuff is where your real chops are, you can start to morph the way those studies look so that they're angling towards implementation science is the next thing we need. At least that was successful for me.
That's great. Kate, what are your thoughts on this sort of starting out implementation grant?
Yeah, and maybe I'll start just one step back, is that I think I was told I was doing implementation science before I realized I was doing implementation science. So I, my pathway to it was that I was always sort of in my dissertation was an HPV vaccination, why people were or were not doing it. And then I sort of moved into breast cancer treatment, why people were or were not following guidelines. And then I sort of got to the NCI, and people, I was similar interested in why people were following guidelines for cervical cancer screening. Like, all of this was, for me, I just wanted to know why people weren't doing the thing that was recommended in clinical practice. And so I didn't realize, of course, for a while, and this was one of the hardest things, I think, and when thinking about shifting between writing an IS grant versus a non-IS grant, is that when you're working in clinical practice, the thing, how we were sort of thinking about it, the thing was not an evidence-based practice. That was the clinical practice, and we were developing interventions. And so I had to shift my brain to know, no. The thing is, the evidence-based practice is what I used to be referring to as the clinical practice, and the intervention now is the strategies by which we're trying to get people to do it. So I think that if you're in that boat where you're like, no, that's not, it's sort of, the language can be really hard, but it's actually helpful to talk with somebody, because they might be really like, you're doing implementation science, you just don't know it. You just have to work through the sort of the language and the jargon, which is hard, which is one of the harder things about the field, I think. So for me, my pilot study that then led to my R01, I didn't have one word of implementation science in there. I had reducing overuse of cervical cancer screening. That's how I framed it. That's what I thought I was doing. And I had great mentors that were like, wait a minute, that's de-implementation, right? And that's implementation science. So that I sort of came along to realize that the shift of the brain. But yeah, so I think the pilot, I had a running track list of all the pilot money that I was trying to, I'd never had a K. I was just trying to get some small money to move forward. So I do think that we'll talk about failure. There was a lot of failure, and you just rework and refine and find your right audience. And when you do, for me, that was implementation science. But when you do find your right audience, luck, perseverance, and humility, you might start to see those numbers shift towards being funded.
So that makes a lot of sense. And for those of you that are new to the field, the thing that Kate is talking about is language that comes from Jeff Curran, who's at the University of Arkansas for Medical Sciences. And he has this wonderful paper that's called Implementation Science Made Too Simple, where he talks about the evidence-based intervention or the practice of interest as the thing. And implementation strategies are the stuff we do to get people to do the thing. And implementation outcomes are how well or how often they do the thing. This is the thing. I have seen the thing language in NIH grant proposals. It's very interesting. It's very catchy. So, Kate, you mentioned failure. I think we should talk about failure. Florence, can you if there's one or two sort of key nuggets from an unsuccessful proposal that had some implementation science in it, what would you share with folks so we can sort of go around the horn?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. And I think that of course it depends sort of, where you are in the spectrum of expertise when it comes to implementation science. But what I would say is the key nuggets that I learned from failure is one is to always take feedback very seriously and not personally, right? And and you know, after the grad gets reviewed, really spending the time to go through all of the reviews and really understand where the flaws were, and leaning on your mentors to help guide you to make it better. Science evolves through failure, right? Like I think of Drew Weissman when he gave his Nobel Peace Prize, his Nobel talk. He failed for, I want to say, 20 years or so before he actually developed the COVID vaccine. And so failure is part of the journey, but it's really sort of how we take failure and how we become better to move forward. So if you're sort of very early on in the field where you're still getting to know the language, perhaps you need to attend one of Meghan's courses and learn the jargon and understand the frameworks and really see how your work can be better shaped with the implementation science lens. But if you're sort of, more advanced and perhaps, you have to think of methodologic issues related to your grant. But I would say, taking feedback very seriously is one of the key learning point that I've sort of taken to heart.
That's a great insight. I'll add there that I think in terms of thinking about methodology, I remember one R01 we put in where we proposed a cluster randomized trial and the reviewers just sort of savaged us about the feasibility of it because our intervention was a complex behavioral intervention. They're like, this isn't going to work. And I was like, you do want to take the feedback to heart, but I think relatedly, one of the learnings was you really have to think about feasibility of an implementation science grant. And it's one thing to write it out on paper and to have all your frameworks and your team and your everything, but people are going to pick apart, rightly, whether this is actually going to work in the real world. Because there are so many things that are going to get in the way of that trial going off the way it's supposed to go. If you're writing a trial, that you really, really, really have to hammer on feasibility and convince yourself and the reviewers that this actually will work. Even if things go sideways, it's still going to work. Chris, can I go to you for a failure lesson?
Yeah, absolutely. We could talk for a long time about that. Yeah, I think areas of proposals that can, I think, be particularly fragile are first, like, is the thing that you're trying to get people to implement, is that truly an evidence-based practice supported by, high quality evidence and ideally also guidelines? Or is it something that's an interesting innovation, a really good idea, but not actually an evidence-based practice? So I think that's something that for folks who are new to IS, including myself, at that stage, I think that sometimes is a really really challenging bridge to cross. But I think it's important to have mentors around you that can critically appraise what you're describing and say, what, we actually need to do a lot more effectiveness related work before we're ready for implementation science. So that's something that I think I probably have seen the most. And then another area of fragility is, let's say you have a great evidence-based practice and you're coming in and you're saying, well, I really think clinical decision support is the way that we're going to solve this problem. And so this is a trial of clinical decision support for this practice, or insert other strategy that you like or want to try. And really, I think in implementation science, I think that funders and review panels just increasingly want to see really good justification of why you chose the strategies that you've chosen. CDS being an example of one that might be valid, but really showing how you went from your needs assessment to a logic model, to engaging stakeholders to really pick those strategies, and then justification for what's the compelling experiment that you're conducting. I'm thinking more on the type 2 and type 3 hybrids here, but what's the compelling experiment that you're doing, comparing different implementation strategies, and why would this trial move the field of implementation science forward and your clinical field forward if it's a clinical project.
Those are great points. And I'll come back to Kate and Amanda, but I'll mention that I'd love us to come back to the concept of where do you submit these grants? You know, who are the right funders? What's the right language for the right funder? And if you're going to NIH, how do you think about a study section, or at least, you know, opining about which study section it should go to? Kate, do you have a failure lesson for us?
Oh, so many. I actually love failure. So I will say, like, I have had like fully embraced failure, and to the point of my own daughter, I would, because she was trying to be a perfectionist as a young child. So I asked her, I realized when I was asking her, how did your day go? It was not the right approach. Instead, I said, what did you fail at today? And it became sort of a positive approach to failing. So why is failure important? It means you're pushing yourself, right? So the same thing with the grant. So if you can see grant failure as that you push an idea out there and that to reward yourself for taking that chance and learn, as has been noted from the experience, for me, then it becomes sort of a positive experience. Again, I think I'm a little bit on the weird end of the failure spectrum, but I do think embracing it as that you did do something great by taking a chance, and you just may need to think and reflect back. The other more tangible thing that was one of the first program officers, she said, well, have you created your weakness grid yet? And I said, well, what's a weakness grid? And she said, take all of the weakness, forget about the positive feedback, go take all of the weakness comments, put it all in one document, and then leave it alone for a bit. Come back to it. And what it helps is it actually separates yourself a little bit from the weaknesses, as to say that, as Florence said, like, it's not personal, right? It's about the science. But you actually start to see the patterns, and this is sort of like a qualitative thematic analysis, right? You start to see where there's overlap, and then where some might be actually more sort of things that you don't necessarily need to address. So that's a tactical tool that I use. I use it with every grant. I have my weakness grids. I save them. And then I try to use that for revisions and other things to sort of move forward. But embrace failure as much as possible. We all live it more than we do the successes.
Definitely. Florence, I know we're going to lose you at the top of the hour, so I'll just pause and say thank you. But I do want to throw to Amanda and see what your failure lessons are.
Oh, again, so many that have already been said, but I want to also echo what Chris said about making sure the thing is implementable, or that implementation science is the right thing. As a nurse implementation scientist who really likes testing strategies, but it doesn't have a clinical practice, that's my favorite thing to always study. I often, I'm asked to partner with folks on grants, usually as an MPI, where we're looking at something, and I kind of rely on them to know for sure that the thing that they've studied forever is really at the stage where it should be implemented. So that subway line paper is really great. And then not trying to boil the ocean in your grant and trying to do a type 3 hybrid, blah, 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 fix the whole entire world. I think a lot of times something that's mostly about effectiveness and just starts to look at what the barriers and facilitators could be is really appropriate. And I find a lot of times we get like too excited about all the at least I do get too excited about all the implementation science and get criticized for trying to do too much. And last thing I'll say, just because I have some funding from like the Department of Defense, which maybe has a little bit of a less sophisticated review panel around implementation science. So a thing I learned from failure is how to write about complicated things and things that people don't have expertise in a way that sounds educated, innovative, and interesting, but is easy to understand. And I think that is a really interesting thing that failure taught me over and over again, is if they can't understand what you're saying, and these are complex studies, you got no hope of getting funded. So the feedback has helped me sort of shift the way that I write about science, so people can understand it, because it's complicated.
Absolutely. So I'm glad you mentioned the DoD. We had a question in the chat about non-NIH funding sources, and so we can talk a little bit about that. But I want to take this question and think through, how do you write about implementation science for a non-implementation science audience? Because I've certainly had to do this. There are study sections at the NIH for implementation science. They're all in on the theories, models, frameworks. You can go, all the way on the language. And then there are others that are like, what are you talking about? So how do you write about this for a non-IS audience?
you want me to start or did?
Sure.
Okay. Well, not that I'm perfect at it, certainly. But I try to think about the people and why. One of the things that the Department of Defense requires you to do in your formatting of the grant is to write a lay summary, because on their impact panels, they have military members and members of the government and all kinds of stakeholders. And so they require you to write that. I've started writing it for everything, just for our team and for myself, because it forces me to put the fancy, the innovative, really cool methodology into a thing that anyone who's an educated person can understand. So I find that really helpful. And there's an art to writing that in a way that doesn't talk down to folks, but just kind of explains the complicated stuff in regular words. So I've been doing that even though I don't have to for other funding sources. And keeping your audience in mind. I'm a nurse. There's some really interesting nursing-centric funding opportunities. Implementation science is a buzzword around everybody, and I don't think a lot of people really know what it is, but they are certainly enthusiastic. So harnessing the enthusiasm, but writing about the reality of what you can and can't do, again, in a way that people can understand, I think is pretty key.
That makes sense. And I love the concepts that you brought up. As an anesthesiologist, I will tell you that my field's embrace of qualitative research is like this big, and implementation science is just a buzzword. And so what I've done is I try to avoid as much jargon as possible. Like I don't talk about hybrid trials. I don't talk about theories, models, and frameworks. I can say implementation science informed approaches and put a couple of citations, or I'm going to look at both effectiveness and implementation outcomes. I'm not going to call it a hybrid. But it is, that's what I'm describing, right? So I do think you want to have your audience in mind, and not get so lost in the language that you sort of lose them. Kate, have you written for non-IS audiences?
Yeah, and I actually, so the foundations and also industry. So industry usually supported through some research mechanisms, so not necessarily, but even so, I'm not discounting that there's a lot of different diverse audiences by which you can seek funding and should be open to if they're aligned with your both value missions and also area. Don't say no before, as someone said, you get the job. Don't say no before you get the funding. But I do think what I find is if I can't explain it in lay terms, it's too complicated or there's something missing, right? I'm trying to force something that's not quite there. So I do think, and you can choose whatever. I think in writing is doing a lay abstract is a brilliant idea, Amanda, for all your work. I think you can also just try to explain it to, for me and my parents, what the heck am I doing and why am I doing it? And if I can't get there, and they're wonderful and amazing and have been watching me for years and they still are like, what? So, but if I can't get them to fully understand the impact and how I'm going to do it, there's usually something that I'm missing. So use that as sort of a gut check. Trust your gut. If you are like, yeah, that will just work, and you can't convince yourself on the feasibility, it's not going to work. So trust your gut and talk to your friends and families. Buy them a bottle of wine if they'll listen to you ramble on, and use their feedback.
I love the talking to your family, and when I teach the introductory implementation science course, I usually for Thanksgiving break, I'll say, go to your families. What are you going to tell them about implementation science? How are you going to explain what this is?
Yeah, for sure.
How about you, Chris?
Yeah, I mean, that resonated with me, Kate. I used to tell people about the mom test. If I was going to propose a grant, I would first talk to my mom about it. If she understood, I knew I was getting at something that would be relevant to a large group of stakeholders.
Yeah.
I have to your question, Megan. I have in the introductory opening paragraphs of we just did this with a PCORI application. Where we just weren't totally sure what the review panel was going to look like. We knew it would probably include a couple, maybe one or two implementation scientists, but might also, would definitely also include stakeholders and clinicians and other scientists who were not implementation scientists. So we just laid out, in this proposal, we're going to use the term strategies to mean this. We're going to use the term intervention to mean this, et cetera. And not in a condescending way, but just to lay out like this, when you see this word, this is what it sort of what we're referring to. And we'll see if that was helpful. I think that if you feel super strong in the theories, models, frameworks, language, going to the SIHH, the Science of Implementation in Health and Healthcare Study section at NIH, is probably going to give you the most predictable results. Would be my suggestion, where you can go in and you can expect folks with training like what Megan and all of us have, to be sitting on that panel. And when you say the CFR, or hybrid trial, there's not going to be people looking around the room saying, "Can somebody explain this to me?" And they're going to be on that panel. But I think as soon as you step away from that, it gets much less predictable. So yeah, Brooke, I'll put that in the chat in a second. I'll put a link to it. So for example, I've had colleagues who have gone to AHRQ and proposed things that were by the book implementation science, but reviewed by study sections that are more generally around sort of like quality and that kind of stuff. And they might get the opposite questions that you might expect. So they might, I saw one set of comments where a pretty rigorous process of strategy selection was described. And one of the comments was, "Why don't you just use clinical decision support?" So I think there things, as you get out from there, it's a little less predictable, but also there may be more opportunity for approaches that are inspired by implementation science, but not necessarily completely according to the textbook.
That makes a lot of sense. I would say you want to look at what the funder has funded before. And if they funded things that look like their implementation science and sort of with the theories and the models and the frameworks and the strategies, you're probably in good shape. And if they really haven't funded anything like that before, then you want to be really careful about your language and really explaining why you're doing what you're doing and how it aligns with maybe what they're more used to. Going back to that question about K awards, I want to encourage people to look at NIH Reporter as a tool online. You'll see specifically for the NIH, and also AHRQ is on there, CDC is on there. You can look up what has been funded before, and there's a function called Matchmaker on NIH Reporter where you can actually put in the text of an abstract from a grant, or you can put in a bunch of keywords and it will show you grants that are similar and what mechanism they were, which institute funded them, which study section reviewed them, and you can get a lot of insight there. But there are NIH institutes that are really, really high on implementation science. NCI is one of them. They put a lot of money, not just into grant funding, but into capacity building as well. And there's actually a lot of videos, I'm unfortunately in one of them, on their website about implementation science. I talk about theories, models, and frameworks. It's great. They have a lot of training videos on their website. NHLBI, Heart, Lung, and Blood, loves implementation science. NIMH, Mental Health, loves it. Who am I missing? Big ones. Are those the big ones? There are some that are getting into it, but it's the ones I think that are like in the space already.
Did you say NCI? Did I miss it?
I did say NCI, yeah.
Yeah.
NIEHS, Environmental Health, is increasingly getting there. NICHD also is getting there. There's a little bit of interest now from NIDCD, which is deafness and other communication disorders. So it's growing. NIDDK, which is diabetes and digestive and kidney, I think. They were, I think, the last institute to join the specific call for implementation science R01s and R21s and R03s, but they're on it now, so that's great. So in terms of K awards, there are some K awards that will go to SAHH, which is the Science of Implementation in Health and Healthcare. I don't know the secret for how to get it there, right? Like if you say my K award is about implementation science, I think some of them go there and some of them don't. So do you guys have any advice on that? I have some K mentees I've tried to advise, but
I actually think that it probably has to stem first for the institutes. Some institutes have a standing K section that I think you just get sent there regardless. And then I think some allow it to be reviewed. So I think it probably starts there, and then there's strategies after that to get it there that are probably trickier.
that makes sense. What I think I would do is go to NIH Reporter and then look specifically for implementation science, but restrict it to K awards. Look for my institute of interest and see kind of where those Ks go, because that should give you some insight.
Yeah. And
So
just
go ahead.
just to sort of, I do think that we're talking about some of these institutes that implementation science is a buzzword. In general, I think the time in which you can just say my study is innovative because it uses implementation science in general is past. There probably are some new funders that you can sort of just touch on, but that is just sort of a word of caution or encouragement to push yourself a little bit on not just that you're applying that, but what it particularly about your work is innovative with the application of implementation science. I think reviewers are getting more savvy and looking for that as the field grows. So both a warning and an encouragement.
I think that's right. And you want to look at the funding opportunity. So if you think about specifically for NIH, those funding opportunities that have implementation science in the title, read the whole NOFO, the Notice of Funding Opportunity, read it, and they'll tell you what they're looking for. So in that one in particular, they are looking to advance the science of implementation. They're looking at the cutting edge of implementation science. So your innovation needs to be in that space. Whereas if it's a, sort of typical investigator initiated R01, maybe that's not where the innovation has to be. So one of the things that you think about as you write these grants, you've got your idea, you've got your aims, you need a team. How do you build a team?
Find people that you like first.
I love that.
I'll say that
Yeah.
out loud. But also, I think building a team, I've approached it from first, people you've worked with before. Obviously, that makes perfect sense, and that's what funders are looking for and published with before and all the things. But also someone who's going to kind of challenge the team to think differently about things, because otherwise, and people who are really beyond the team, when you're talking about co-investigators and folks that really want to give the time or not just give the name or whatever to the project, at least for me as an earlier person, I find that super helpful. And then as I'm working, I think about the budget a little bit and kind of what's available, and sometimes thinking through whether that's something to subcontract out or versus I need an investigator. That's another way I kind of think through the team. But I first really try to find people that I love to think with and talk about science with, because I know that they'll make the end product better, and then go from there. Maybe that's too squishy, but that's what I think about
I think
first.
that's too squishy. I will say these teams tend to be larger.
Yeah.
And when you think about what you need on an implementation science team, you need someone who knows the field. You need methodologists, so people who are very comfortable with qual and can show that they've done it and are comfortable with it. People that are comfortable with quant and biostats specifically related to implementation science. You need people who have content expertise. It's a really good idea to have someone with lived experience, whether that's a patient partner or someone else whose behavior you're trying to change. And I'd say it's pretty common to have something like an advisory board, whether that's a community advisory board, an internal advisory board, a steering committee, a something, to have some additional perspectives on things. Other
And
thoughts about, oh, sorry, go
Oh,
go ahead.
I was just going to add to that, and thinking about most implementation studies are not single care area or single place, and so who's got the entree in the different environments, and who's got the credibility in the different sites, and how much can you rely on them for kind of larger scale testing is another thing I think about.
Yeah, definitely.
I think the only thing I would add is that make sure as you're building the teams that they are complementary. There can be some overlap, but don't just stack your deck with 6 implementation scientists. Really make it clear what, there can be some overlap, but why is that person on it, and why are they needed, and what are they feeling that another person isn't? And because that's sometimes you'll see all these roles that they're, amazing, but they're doing the same thing. And so some of that is, particularly as these get really large, as a non-physician, as a non-clinician, that is why I love MPI grants. And usually my MPI is a clinician. So we are very complementary in our methods and our content area and can push forward. So that we maybe look different for you, but make sure that you can say what they're doing somewhat uniquely, so you don't get dinged by reviewers for just padding your budget.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I'll give myself as an example. I have an R01 where I'm the PI, and I had Renad Betis, who, many of you know, who's now at Northwestern, also on the grant. And then the question becomes, why do you need both of them? And it's because I'm going to lead the whole grant and do most of the IMPSI, but she was really good at implementation mapping, which I wasn't great at. And so I said, okay, so Renad's going to help me with implementation mapping. And that's viable, right? Like, she has a specific role, but you do sometimes see when people just put names on there, and you're like, do you need 3 statisticians? So Chris, how do you build your team?
Yeah, no, I'll second your comment and Kate's comment about the MPI or the co-PI model. I think it's really really effective and super fun. So I've had grants where I've been sort of the more junior implementation scientist, but sort of accomplished sort of effectiveness researcher, and paired that with a card-carrying implementation scientist as a co-PI. And I've also seen examples that make a lot of sense where, maybe the card-carrying, PhD implementation scientist or MD implementation scientist is quite busy and won't be able to, and will help to advise things. But I've seen that stacked, and I've actually proposed this in another trial, stacking that with like an assistant professor implementation scientist, so that you have like the expertise and the reputation and the guidance of the senior person, but you also have someone who can do more of the on the ground implementation science related work, who's maybe a bit more junior and has more time to give.
Yeah, I love that model, and it can work really well. There is a question about, whether you need a card-carrying implementation scientist if you're proposing a hybrid. I think it sort of depends on where you're going with it and who the funder is. If you're not using implementation science language, they're probably not going to be primed to look for an implementation scientist. But if you're going to NIH and you're being reviewed by the implementation science people and you're using all the words, they're going to say, well, who on your team has this expertise? Now, I will say card carrying is a very soft phrase. There is no, board certification in implementation science. There are certificates, there are some degree programs. Most of the people that do this took a couple of courses and have a lot of practical experience. And they apply the theories, models, frameworks, but they come to it from many different disciplines. So I don't want you to feel like it's meant to be exclusive. But if someone feels like they have that expertise and then can demonstrate on their biosketch, look, I've done this work, I've published in this space, and the grant reads like an implementation scientist actually looked at it and had something to do with it. Sometimes you'll just see a framework named on the Ames page and then never mentioned again, and you're like, really? So that's how I think I would answer that question. Let's talk about the budget. The budget is related to the team, but not just that. How do you budget? And maybe start with a K. How do you think about budgeting for a K in implementation science? And then we can talk about some of the larger grants.
I guess I can start. I think that often in a K, you're probably not doing a multi-center trial. You're probably doing something that's quite a bit upstream of that. And I put in a chat earlier, I love implementation mapping as something that is very approachable and can be very low cost for a trainee. And just to describe that briefly, so many of us are at the point where there is an evidence-based practice. There's a guideline. There's good evidence behind it, but that doesn't mean you're ready to write a full trial proposal, right? You're not necessarily ready to write an R1. There are other questions that need to be asked that are in the middle, in that in-between state between I have this EVP and I'm ready to do a cluster randomized trial. And so that kind of work can be really great as part of a K. And so budgeting for implementation mapping. So generally, the first step is really doing a needs assessment and understanding essentially like, why aren't people doing this? What are the barriers that have kept people from adopting this practice, or in de-implementation have kept people away from stopping doing this practice? So really understanding what are those barriers or determinants of the current practice. And so budgeting qual work, you just have to think about, okay, are they interviews or focus groups? Are we transcribing? Are we, who's analyzing? Are we double coding? How are we, sort of putting all that stuff together? But that's the kind of thing that can be accomplished, across a year or two of a K budget, depending on how much of it you're doing yourself and how much of it you're farming out. And then other steps in implementation mapping include like getting stakeholders together, operationalizing implementation strategies, and then ultimately coming up with what's the experiment that you're going to design. So I like that, and that often, that would include, the qual related work, potentially paying a consultant or a statistician who might be helping, although rules around Ks and paying for that kind of stuff can differ. But I don't know, that's my 2 cents for now.
What do you all think? That K budget goes quick.
I never, as I said, I never had a K, but I can say I've been the mentor on many Ks. And usually what I do is the same, again, like that as Chris said, sort of figuring it out, but also figuring it out in the way that you choose your right mentors. So if you choose the right mentors, you know, they can help in different ways and how you put that on your budget. But so what you budget for is one thing, but also just making sure that you have mentors that are going to support you in ways that are going to continue the work beyond what you have on that specific budget. At least that's how I approach it with my mentees.
Yeah, and I'll just say, and I didn't, I had a K, but it was a K-12, so I didn't have to make a budget for that. It was a little bit different mechanism, but I will say when I talk with folks about Ks who are interested in implementation science, at least in my field, which is a little less trainee heavy, it's normally, you know, assistant professors in nursing who are thinking of doing implementation science work, and there's that learning piece, and you're like, well, how much do I really need to take classes and get a certificate versus just, like Chris said, or like Kate said, get a great mentor and work on things. And I think sometimes we always think a class is going to be the answer, and sometimes it is. And formal training, and that's, I know, a piece of K award budgets, but also thinking through how much of that do you need versus how much will actually having your name on a paper with some data that looks like implementation science mean to the future of your fundability as you move past the K.
Great points. And I'd also, the only other thing I would add would think about publications. Many of the journals in this space, especially the flagship journal Implementation Science, is an open access journal that has publication fees. And so budgeting for that's really important. Moving on to larger grants. So I'll give the experience of my R01. So R01s from NIH generally have a cap of $500,000 in direct costs per year, where the institution's overhead rate is charged on top of that. And I remember writing an R01 and thinking, well, that's a lot of money, $500,000 a year, until you start to budget for like 20 people at a bunch of different sites, and it goes really quickly. So I remember writing up the Ames page for the R01, sending it to the program officer and saying, hey, can we chat? And she goes, this is really ambitious. Can you do this for $500,000 a year? And I said, I'm an early stage investigator. Are you going to give me more than $500,000 a year? And she goes, nah. So I'm like, okay, I'm going to have to make it work. So you look for in-kind support from your institution. You look for all of the things that you can leverage to try to make the thing happen. But, you know, for me, the biggest part of the budget was people, far and away.
Yeah.
There were some participant incentives. There were some transcription things. There were some, you know, travel costs for meetings. But how do you all start to think? Because that's one of the first things your grants manager's like, okay, that's great. What's the budget?
Yeah, I mean, I will say that for me, same people, and there was a question I answered in the chat that we did have the only tangible thing usually that we have besides the people, like we don't have labs, but was our partnership with a startup company. And so most of the time it is mostly people, but you do want to also think about it. I think that the clinics or the places you're working with, you know, making sure that what you're adding, there's always something usually you're adding, even if it's the implementation, usually something to their workflow, right? So having some sort of support for them in your budget is nice as well. That might be a chunk of money. It might be travel. It might be something, but thinking through how you can, for lack of better words, compensate those more squishy time and resources and energy. Really, it helps to build that partnership as well. So I always try to have, usually, sometimes I'll call it intervention costs. But, you know, trying to have some wiggle room so that if they're like, hey, you know, is there any way you can offset some of our training time under the allowances of grants? That's also, you have to be very clear. It's helpful for that success of the partnership.
Great. So I've been trying to pepper in some of the questions from the chat, but I want to sort of, you know, mindfully transition to some of the questions in the chat. Anything else that maybe Amanda or Chris want to add before I kind of go directly to the chat?
I would just add one of the things that where there's really no rules or standards for is if you're doing a cluster randomized trial, you know, how exactly are you compensating the sites? And, you know, in pediatric hospital medicine, for example, there are some research/QI networks where sites will actually pay to participate in your project as opposed to you paying them on the subcontract. There are others where the expectation is like a pretty hefty subcontract for each site that's participating in your trial. So I think understanding the field and the context in which you're doing that, if you are doing a cluster randomized trial, and really trying to really trying to do what you need to do to support those sites to adequately conduct the research that you're asking them to do. And not necessarily, unless there are major budgetary constraints, not necessarily paying them sort of as little as possible, which I've seen in other folks' projects.
I'll add one quick thing there, thinking about the subcontracts. There are lots of people that you have to work with to get an implementation science grant across the finish line. It's not just you. So even if you can go hard for, 3 weeks in a row, you've got to get subcontracts figured out. You've got to get other people's bio sketches and all the things. So my sense is it takes a lot longer to get all those pieces in play than it might for a grant that has a smaller footprint. Amanda?
Yeah, I was just going to say on the sort of sites that will participate in the study budget, something that we've done, because I'm interested in things that the whole team has to change, not just a physician scientist. And when you do a site PI model for your budget, that goes into the salary of usually a physician or somebody, and that's not a way that other team members can feel like participants in the study. So we do professional service agreements where we pay funds to a program or an educational fund for nurses and other types of clinicians that work on the study. It's both cost effective, and it helps folks get motivated when it's not just scientists, clinicians who need effort for their time. If that's a lot of these studies involve lots of folks, and so a way to think about that a little differently is who's going to be partnering with you on the research, and what would compensation look like to them meaningful so that they feel like a part of it.
Yeah,
That's great.
Involvement in a paper is not that is not what people want. All people, which is the classic, right, scientific model. So yeah, completely.
You'll be involved in a paper in 10 years. It'll be great.
We're great.
So we did, in addition to the chat questions, we had some pre-submission questions, so I don't want to ignore those. We got a question about what sort of preliminary evidence would be beneficial to include in an implementation-focused grant. So who wants to field that one?
I mean, I think we've talked a fair amount about the implementation mapping process and sort of some way that you're saying, okay, this is the EBP and the evidence is essentially bulletproof. Not really, but pretty good. Here's a guideline that we have. Here's the process that we use to understand barriers and how we get to strategies. And then the last thing that will really seal the deal is if you thinking that you're proposing a type 2 or type 3 hybrid is kind of where my head is at. But if you're in that space, if you have some form of a pilot trial, even if it's small, even if it's single center, that's demonstrating that, even if it's only your baseline strategies that you're using, if you can show that those are feasible, acceptable, appropriate, that folks will actually take part in the strategies in the way that you want them to, I think can be huge in sealing the deal with a funder.
Yeah, because you don't want to just say, well, we're going to pilot a bunch of I think I've gotten a ding before for saying we're going to pilot these strategies. We don't know what they are yet till we ask people. That doesn't work out great, even though that's sort of what we do. So like there's ways to quickly, I call it a signal or a pulse check, and just to have like a quick survey, clinicians, hey, do you like this? Is it acceptable, feasible? As Chris said, there's some instruments you can do that are pretty low cost and low burden for that. And including that as pilot data can be really compelling in telling the story that it's not just that we don't know what to do, it's that people may not like the thing, and this is why. These are some reasons they might like this new thing we're going to try, and so we're going to try that. But it's probably, I think people think that the pilot data has to be more robust than it, in my experience, has to be about implementation. About the evidence-based practice, that pilot data's got, that data, not pilot data, has to be real strong. But around the how you're going to test implementation interventions, that part can be, like Chris said, a little more of a signal towards, and this is why you're going to continue to test in a more rigorous way.
I agree with that. And I have a mentee who has a K that's pending, and there isn't necessarily trial data that is exactly the thing that he's proposing, but he can show, I've done this piece of it, I've done that piece of it, I've done this piece of it, and so it becomes easier to see how it all fits together because he's done all the individual pieces of it. So that kind of pilot data you can put in as well. So there was a question about, let me go to the pre questions here. Can you comment on the established hierarchy of implementation science outcomes that you recommend be targeted to move the field forward? How do you balance the outcomes that are easy to measure versus hard to measure? Because because some of the harder ones are the ones that are more important. How do you pick implementation outcomes?
Maybe so another strategy I do, and this is a larger strategy, is, and I see this a lot, particularly when you're trying to write a grant, there's a lot that's important. You know the context, you know a lot is important. And the worst thing you can do is try to shove it all into one grant. But sometimes you need a strategy to try to put it somewhere so you don't lose it. So I have this folder, it's like grant ideas, I throw them in there, I know they're there, I'm ready for them when I, sort of, the other is figuring out the steps. So I think for the implementation outcome is try to step back. There is a hierarchy, and I think the field in general, we need to continue to grow and push. But when you're writing a specific grant, remember, you're not taking on the entire field. Find your content and really be clear why that is the most important implementation outcome for your study. And then over time, hopefully start to push the field forward. But you're not on the hook to change the entire field in one grant. So you can put that for your future career, lifelong work.
Sounds great. So we mentioned the card carrying implementation scientist. Brooke wants to know what sells a person as an implementation scientist. Is it applied experience? Is it prior grants? Is it pubs? Is it training? What makes a convincing argument that this person is your implementation scientist on your grant?
I think it's experience, which could be some combination of all of the things that were listed there. I think practically, if you're applying for a large trial grant in implementation science and you haven't done one before, the card carrying part comes in when you can say, Dr. Lane-Fall has successfully run, 3 prior type 3 hybrid effectiveness implementation trials. And that's why, even though I'm not the right person, I have this co-PI who totally is, and this is how we're gonna work together. I think it's pretty practical. I think that on the ground experience of running something similar to what you're proposing in the grant is probably what will resonate most with the reviewers.
I'll say, like, I have the experience of being an assistant professor who has like some decent credentials in the space, but a lot of people don't want me to be their implementation scientist because I don't have like the rank that they might think that somebody externally is looking for, right? And so that's when you talk about what Chris says, that structure of I've got Chris or I've got Megan or somebody else who's going to, but I'm like really the tactical. And I think thinking through that is helpful because even sometimes I'm surprised, even though I have my own funded stuff, that people don't think I'm necessarily card carrying, even though I've done some of those things because there's no card. So I think it's about matching skills and expertise with what the grant needs and showing that you can handle that in some kind of track record that's meaningful to the funder. And sometimes rank matters more, I think, that I like to admit in my world.
I think in many of our worlds, and I think that speaks to the bias that comes along with review, that I don't think the reviewers are supposed to bring that. And I review for study section and they give us all sorts of guidance on don't call people junior and look at their qualifications and look at the team and all of those things. But Amanda, I think you're right that there is a bias, especially when someone has that assistant professor rank of them going, well, then they must not have that much experience. And we know that's not true. So there are ways to kind of beef up that sense of, yes, I can do all of the things. Having undergone training is useful. It's definitely not sufficient. Having had grants in a space, having published is really helpful. And then to Amanda's point, even if you are the person, if you know that there might be a question of whether you are, having that senior person that you can lean on if you need to and show them like, look, there's other folks, can be strategic. Wonderful. So capacity building. Well, there's a few field specific questions, but I want to hold off on those right now. Laura Ellen wants to know how we move beyond traditional sources of knowledge and implementation science grants. And I think this is especially important as we think about considerations of equity and community partnered research and valuing and uplifting lived experience as opposed to sort of a traditional, like everything's got to be a randomized control trial. So how do we handle that in these funding agencies that are used to these?
So I'll maybe start, and it's something that I when I was at again, the anthropologist, right, we thought RCT was a 4-letter word. We do think RCT is a 4-letter word. And so I actually had to come full grips of now doing a whole bunch of RCTs and have these existential crises often.
Gone to the dark side.
I've totally gone to the dark side. But I teach in my course. If you sound like a positivist in your grant, and then you say you're gonna prioritize lived experience, you're gonna get some problems. But there actually are sort of, there are worldviews, epistemological, ontological, whatever you want to frame, that align with your methods. So I do think that's how you have to convey it to the reviewers. The reviewers have to have it make sense. And it has to make sense from what you're gonna do, how you're gonna do it, why you're doing it, and then what you're gonna do with the data after. If you're gonna say you're gonna then change guidelines, you probably better have an RCT. If you're going to say you're going to advance community narratives as a way to explain to policymakers, the importance of X, Y, or Z, then you can do an interpretive framework. So I just think making sure, again, that you're sort of coming to grips with what you think you're going to be able to do with your data will help us push. But I also said, I'm not sure NIH, as someone told me, NIH loves innovation, but you better not be too innovative. So you better walk slowly, and there's probably other funders to really push the envelope.
That's such an important point. Like the NIH is not the end all and be all of everything. The indirect rates we like, sure. But there are limitations to what that structure is going to be able to recognize as worthy of moving forward. Other thoughts about holding up other types of knowledge?
I was just thinking how they did that just big review paper came out about qualitative methodology and implementation science. And in it, it states very clearly that most of it is from a positivist perspective. And as a nurse who in my field, we do a lot of qualitative research that's not from that lens, I was reflecting on it. And it's a probably symptom of the fact that a lot of us are getting funding from NIH and places that really like that sort of deductive approach and a little bit a priori having idea of what the answer is going to be. And I think it would be also a really great challenge for the field if we could actually move towards a little more of traditional approaches to qualitative analysis. We might find that there's some things there that we're missing in the deductive approach.
I will say, you can write about something in a grant and you want to execute what you said you would do if you get the grant, but it doesn't stop you from doing additional things. And so I think there are opportunities to bring in lived experience and to bring in a more interpretivist or constructivist lens to the qualitative analysis that you do if you do qual. So one of the things that we're doing in our handoff R01 is we're using rapid qualitative approaches. We're using thematic analysis for a lot of things to just move it forward, right? What are the barriers for facilitators? How do we design strategies that's very action oriented? But then we're also going to go back and do inductive analysis to figure out what's there. What are people telling us? What can we learn from this? What are we learning that's not in line with the frames that we started with? And it's not perfect from a sort of interpretivist perspective, but I think there are ways to build that into the work that you do. And as we start to publish more on that and learn more about that, then hopefully those ways of knowing sort of bubble up to the top in importance. Okay. We got through a lot of questions. What else would you all like to share? I think we can probably start to draw it to a close. We've been talking for a long time, and I know there's a lot of tips.
I think maybe just this question about any tips for lived experience, because it sort of dovetails on the conversation we just were having.
Yep.
Again, anthropology, when I came into the field, we were criticized for what was called as navel gazing, right? We were very much as a field in the stage in which we were really thinking about our own positionality. There was a debate between science and humanities and whether or not we fell into one or the other. And so I do think that, and again, this is the audience, be clear in your audience, there is this movement towards positionality and reporting positionality in your study. But again, I always think you want to check yourself. Does that make sense in your study? Don't just do it because again, a very, very structured positivist view and you're a very, objective approach, and then you throw in who you are, you're going to get some weird responses versus that you are actually having a stance of an emancipatory theory or whatever it may be that's aligned. So just because the field is sort of starting to do something, make sure it makes sense in your work and how it aligns. So and that's what reviewers will usually, the sniff test, right? If it just feels tacked on, whether it be positionality or methods or a framework, they usually pick it up. But if you think it influences what you're doing, it's an important report, then you should report it.
Yeah, I'd say I agree with everything you said, and I think there's a little bit of risk here, and it's hard to know how to balance the risk because you want to be honest about who you are, and it might actually inform how the reviewers see you. And I've certainly used statements like that in grants more where I was a co-I. So I remember Scott Halpern has a center here that's around improving clinical trial representation in cardiovascular trials. And in my bio sketch, I said, I'm a Black woman whose father died of heart failure. So I'm like in it, right? And that felt great. I can bring all of my implementation science expertise, but I can also say I have a dog in this race because I want to improve representation in trials. Would I say that if I were the PI? I don't know. How would it be received? How is it received from people that look like me versus people that don't look like me? I don't know. You know, David Feigenbaum has done really well in highlighting how he has had Castleman's disease and he's fought for funding and is doing great work in that space. And that's really, really well received. Would that play out the same for someone else? I just don't know. I know that when I talk to communities, that lived experience is really valued. And you have a different sort of gravitas when you say, I'm in this. I think that's really useful. But whether you pull it through in a grant is something I would say talk to your mentors about because there are risks, I think, either way. Okay, so I'm going to unspotlight all of us. I'll give, if anybody has a question that they feel like they really want to ask, feel free to unmute yourself. Let's see, I'll unspotlight everybody. Oh, remove spotlight. There we go. Any questions before we bring everything to a close? I'm sure I missed something in the chat. Laura Ellen, anything you want to add? You've been an active chat participant.
Not at all. I think this was wonderful. And yeah, I've gotten several direct messages about how great this has been and how helpful, and people are currently writing grants. And so I think this makes a lot of sense. The only perhaps thing I will add is if folks have affiliations or are interested in doing implementation science work within the VA, doing research and high quality quality improvement work in VA is quite different. And so if you're interested in additional resources or learning more about that, I would say, please reach out to me. I'll put my email in the chat and we can talk, because I think there's also great opportunities and great work happening on the VA side. It's structured and looks a bit different than what NIH work looks like.
Great points. Thank you so much. All right, everyone, have a great day. Thanks for joining us. We'll get this posted as soon as we can and see you the next time.
Can I put one plug in, Megan?
Please do. Go ahead.
There were so many great ideas that were kicked around in the chat, and it sounds like so many folks are working on projects. We welcome works in progress sessions at PISCE, so feel free to reach out to us. I think Day is the correct person to reach out to. Is that right, Megan? Yeah.
Yep, that's right.
So if you have a project, if you're working on a grant, if you want to get some feedback, that's a wonderful venue to do it, and we enjoy attending those as well and giving that feedback.
Chris gets extra credit, man.
Yeah, he does. Great plug. Great plug.
Thanks,
All right, now we can say
everyone.
goodbye, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.